They told us Iwo Jima was a battle of heroism, of Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi. But what they never told you is what it felt like to be on the other side. Imagine being a young Japanese soldier, sealed in a dark tunnel beneath the volcanic rock, your rations cut, the air thick with smoke, listening to the earth shake as thousands of American shells ripped the island apart. For the men trapped underground, there was no glory, only the certainty of death. And yet, their orders were clear. Fight to the last man. No surrender. In this video, we'll uncover their hidden world, the endless tunnels, the brutal daily life, the mental toll of waiting for death to come, and the shocking strategies they were forced to carry out. By the end, you'll see Iwo Jima not as a simple battlefield, but as a graveyard designed in advance, one where nearly every Japanese soldier would perish. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear will change how you see this battle forever. By late 1944, Japan knew Iwo Jima was doomed. The island was tiny, just 8 square miles of volcanic ash, but its importance was enormous. It sat directly between American bomber bases in the Marianas and the Japanese homeland. To the US, it was a stepping stone to Tokyo. To Japan, it was the front line of defense. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the man chosen to defend it, understood the grim truth. Reinforcements would never come, and every soldier sent there was essentially being buried alive in advance. Unlike previous battles where Japan launched wild banzai charges, Kuribayashi devised a new strategy, one of calculated death. His men would dig in, fortify themselves underground, and bleed the Americans for every inch of the island. The plan was not to survive, but to delay. For the 21,000 Japanese troops assigned to Iwo Jima, this reality sank in long before the first shot was fired. Soldiers arrived by transport ships, knowing there would be no way off. Each one was ordered to fight until death, with no thought of retreat. Letters home were censored, last wills were written, and many knew they would never see their families again. The preparation wasn't just military, it was psychological. They were told that their deaths would buy time for the empire, protecting women and children back home. But deep down, many realized they were being sacrificed. What followed was months of grueling labor, digging miles of tunnels through choking volcanic rock, constructing pillboxes, and stockpiling what little food and ammunition they had. Every soldier became part of a living tomb. Daily life for the Japanese garrison was claustrophobic, suffocating, and brutal. Kuribayashi ordered a massive tunnel system beneath Iwo Jima's surface. Over 11 miles of underground passages, connected bunkers, and hidden artillery positions. Soldiers spent nearly every waking moment inside these tunnels. The heat was unbearable. Volcanic fumes mixed with the stench of sweat and decay. Ventilation was almost non-existent, and soldiers sometimes passed out from lack of oxygen. Food rations were meager, mostly rice balls, canned fish, and occasionally horse meat. Water was even more scarce, often brackish or contaminated. Malnutrition and dehydration weakened many before they ever fired a bullet. But the greatest strain was psychological. Soldiers slept knowing American ships circled the island, pounding it with constant bombardments. For 74 days before the land invasion, U.S. Navy guns hammered Iwo Jima, turning the surface into a moonscape. Inside the tunnels, walls shook and ceilings collapsed. Some suffocated as tunnels caved in. Others lived for weeks, surrounded by the smell of unburied comrades. And yet, there was no escape. Soldiers were under strict order. No one could abandon their post, no matter how hopeless. Kuribayashi's discipline was harsh. Any sign of retreat or cowardice could result in execution by one's own officer. In effect, the tunnels became both fortress and prison. What was presented as clever defense felt, to the men inside, like slow entombment. For the Japanese trapped beneath the volcanic soil, the war wasn't about glory. It was about enduring each day in darkness, waiting for the Americans to come. Before a single Marine set foot on Iwo Jima, the Japanese endured one of the most relentless bombardments of the entire Pacific War. U.S. Navy Navy battleships and cruisers opened fire day and night, sometimes unleashing thousands of shells in a single hour. For 74 consecutive days, the island was pounded from sea and sky. American pilots dropped bombs so frequently that the surface looked like it had been scraped raw. To the Americans, this seemed like preparation for an easy invasion, but to the Japanese inside, it was a nightmare and, strangely, a grim reassurance. Kuribayashi had designed his defenses precisely to survive this onslaught. The tunnels ran deep, reinforced with concrete, and many artillery pieces were hidden in caves invisible to American spotters. Still, survival came at a cost. The bombardment shattered morale. Soldiers described the ground trembling constantly, as if the island itself was groaning in agony. Food storage areas were destroyed, cutting off rations. Medicine supplies were smashed, meaning wounds that might have been survivable became fatal. Sleep was impossible. Men went for days awake, jumping at every impact. Death became random. One unlucky collapse, and an entire squad might be buried alive. Yet when the smoke cleared, the defenders emerged. Many felt a grim pride that they had endured what seemed unendurable, but just as many sank deeper into despair, realizing the invasion hadn't even begun. They knew what awaited them, an enemy with overwhelming firepower and endless reinforcements, while they were trapped with dwindling supplies, already half-starved, and no hope of rescue. The bombardment was supposed to break them. Instead, it locked them tighter into a suicidal resolve. For the men underground, the only future left was death. On February 19, 1945, the U.S. Marines launched the invasion. Over 70,000 men prepared to storm an island defended by barely 21,000 Japanese. American intelligence assumed the Japanese had been annihilated by the naval bombardment. The beaches looked strangely quiet. Marines hit the black volcanic sand expecting token resistance, but what they found was worse. The ash-like ground swallowed their boots, making every step exhausting. Heavy tanks and vehicles bogged down almost instantly. Still, for the first hour, there was eerie silence. Some Marines began to believe the Japanese had been destroyed or had abandoned the island. Then, at Kuribayashi's signal, the mountain erupted. From the slopes of Mount Suribachi and hidden bunkers inland, Japanese artillery, mortars, and machine guns unleashed a coordinated barrage. Thousands of Marines were cut down within minutes. Unlike earlier battles where Japanese troops wasted lives in suicidal charges, Kuribayashi's plan was deliberate. Every shot had been calculated to create maximum carnage. Marines had nowhere to hide. The beach provided no cover. They dug desperately into the volcanic ash with their helmets, trying to escape the bullets slicing through the air. Landing craft burned. Men drowned under the weight of their gear, and the beaches became a killing field. From underground tunnels, Japanese defenders emerged to fire, then disappeared again like ghosts. For the Marines, it was chaos. For the Japanese, it was grim satisfaction. They had prepared for this moment for months, and yet, even as the Americans suffered staggering losses, the defenders knew they couldn't stop the invasion. Their orders weren't to win. Their orders were to drag the fight into the heart of the island, inflicting as many deaths as possible before their own annihilation. As the battle pushed inland, the true scale of Kuribayashi's defensive genius became clear. American troops expected to wipe out the Japanese in a week. Instead, they faced a nightmare that lasted over a month. Every hill was a fortress. Every cave hid a machine gun. The tunnels connected positions so well that when Marines thought they had cleared an area, Japanese troops reappeared hours later, firing from behind. It was as if the island itself was alive, spitting death from every shadow. Life for the Japanese defenders grew even more unbearable. Ammunition dwindled, food rotted, and water supplies ran out. Soldiers survived on handfuls of rice, sometimes even grass or insects. They fought while dehydrated, malnourished, and wounded. Yet, their discipline remained unshaken. Kuribayashi had forbidden senseless banzai charges, and instead, his men fought like phantoms. At night, they crept into Marine camps, stabbing guards or blowing up fuel depots before vanishing underground. During the day, they unleashed coordinated ambushes, holding fire until the enemy was within yards. Marines described it as fighting shadows. No one ever knew where the next shot would come from, but the cost was devastating. For every Marine who fell, dozens of Japanese died. They were entombed in collapsed tunnels, burned alive by flamethrowers, or suffocated by explosives pumped into caves. Still, many fought on despite horrific injuries. Soldiers missing limbs, blinded by burns, or coughing blood from disease. To surrender was unthinkable. Most believed capture meant disgrace, worse than death. In many cases, Japanese soldiers carried grenades not to use against the enemy, but to blow themselves up before capture. For the Americans, it was a hellish realization. This was not a battle of strategy, but of extermination. The defenders weren't trying to survive. They were trying to take as many with them as possible. As weeks passed, the battle turned from organized resistance into a slow, suffocating massacre. The Japanese soldiers who had once believed their deaths would be honorable began to crumble under starvation and exhaustion. The tunnels that had shielded them became prisons of despair. Corpses piled in corners, too dangerous to bury outside. The stench of rotting flesh mixed with sulfur fumes made breathing almost unbearable. Rats feasted on the dead, and disease spread through the ranks. Soldiers who once wrote letters home with pride now scribbled final notes in despair, often soaked with blood or tears, knowing no one would ever read them. Some Japanese began to question the purpose of their suffering. The emperor's propaganda had promised that dying on Iwo Jima was a noble sacrifice for Japan's survival, but reality painted a different picture. They were isolated, abandoned, and slowly being exterminated by an enemy that never seemed to run out of men or ammunition. Morale fractured. A few disobeyed Kuribayashi's orders and attempted desperate banzai charges, only to be cut down instantly. Others killed themselves in the tunnels rather than endure another day of suffocating darkness. Suicide by grenade became common. Sometimes even groups of soldiers huddled together, pulling pins all at once. For Kuribayashi himself, the collapse was heartbreaking. He had trained his men to fight with discipline and dignity, but the reality of starvation and hopelessness was impossible to ignore. His army was dissolving into death and madness. Still, even in the final weeks, small groups of Japanese soldiers launched counterattacks that terrified the Marines. Starving, delirious, and broken, they fought with a ferocity that left survivors shaken. It was less a battle now, and more a slow death march into oblivion. By the final weeks of the battle, the once carefully rationed stockpiles had dwindled to almost nothing. Japanese soldiers inside Iwo Jima's tunnels found themselves staring at empty rice sacks and rusted cans, their stomachs hollow and gnawing. Many hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. The rations that were left were little more than scraps. Small handfuls of dry rice, a few slivers of pickled radish, sometimes even weeds pulled from cracks near cave mouths. Starvation began to carve itself into their faces, eyes sunk deep into sockets, cheekbones sharp under stretched skin. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing louder than the bombs outside. Some soldiers spoke in whispers of hallucinations, of phantom banquets, of family dinners back home. Others began to break under the strain, wandering out into the open in delirium, where they were quickly cut down by American fire. Still, the code of Bushido demanded that they endure. Letters written in shaking hands described how their stomachs screamed, but their loyalty to the emperor could not falter. One Japanese survivor later recalled that he licked condensation from the tunnel walls to keep his mouth wet and chewed on leather straps for a false sense of food. The men were wasting away, even as the Americans kept pressing forward. Every bullet they fired, every grenade they tossed, was done on an empty stomach, and yet they refused to surrender. Hunger had become just another weapon, one that was killing them faster than any Marine bullet could. By mid-March, Iwo Jima was a graveyard, yet inside the tunnels, the last surviving units clung to their weapons, waiting for the inevitable. Knowing that death was certain, Japanese commanders ordered banzai charges, frantic, desperate rushes against the American positions. But unlike earlier battles in the Pacific, the Iwo Jima charges were often fragmented, disorganized, and heartbreaking. Men who could barely stand from hunger and exhaustion strapped on bayonets, and ran straight into walls of machine gun fire. Some stumbled forward, coughing blood. Others dragged themselves with wounded legs, screaming prayers to the emperor. The Americans were stunned at first, but the charges were brutally ineffective. Entire squads of Japanese soldiers were cut down in minutes. For the men launching them, however, these final assaults were not about victory. They were about honor. They were a way to avoid the shame of capture, a final burst of defiance against an overwhelming enemy. One Marine diary described watching a wave of starving men come charging, only to collapse halfway across the black sand, too weak to even reach the front line. The Marines opened fire, but there was a grim silence afterward, as even the victors understood that they had witnessed something both terrifying and tragic. For the Japanese, it was the only way left to die with dignity, by showing that even in their final moments, they would not lay down their arms. When the guns finally fell quiet on Iwo Jima, nearly the entire Japanese garrison had been annihilated. Of the roughly 21,000 soldiers who defended the island, only around 200 were taken prisoner. The rest were dead, buried in tunnels, crushed under bombardments, or slain in hopeless charges. For Japan, Iwo Jima became both a symbol of sacrifice and a warning of what awaited them as the war closed in on the home islands. For the men who died there, their suffering remained hidden beneath layers of silence. Survivors who did make it home rarely spoke of the battle. To describe the starvation, the endless bombardments, the claustrophobic terror of living underground, these things were considered shameful in a culture that demanded bravery above all. Families often never knew how their sons died, only that they had fallen honorably on Iwo Jima. In truth, many had wasted away in the dark, or taken their own lives with grenades rather than be captured. The Americans raised their flag on Mount Suribachi, a moment immortalized in photographs and film. But for the Japanese, there was no such symbol, only the silence of the dead. The tunnels they built became tombs, still echoing today with the memory of men who fought until nothing remained. That is the dark truth of Iwo Jima from the Japanese side. Not one of glory, but of starvation, desperation, and silence that still haunts history.